Hello, everyone. So just by way of background, I've been an entrepreneur for many, many years, over a decade now. And like a lot of you out there, I'm sure you'll appreciate this sentiment. I've started lots and lots of products, and they all started out as awesome ideas. However, not all of them went on to become awesome products. Now, sure, like everyone else, I wanted to have more successes than failures, but I knew that good ideas are rare and hard to find. And so you have to go through lots of stuff that doesn't work before you find the things that do. So in a way, I was ready for the search process. I know you had to search for those good ideas. What I wasn't ready for was the cycle time between those ideas. So you see, at the time, I was taking around 1.5 to 2 years from the time I had the initial spark of an idea to when I knew whether I was going to keep the idea or double down on it or get rid of it. And frankly, that was too long. A lot of you here in the room, well, I would say most of you here in the room are young, but once you fall in love with an idea, very soon it consumes years of your life. And you soon begin to realize that you have more ideas than time. And so this became my personal mantra and what got me started on this journey of finding better and faster ways. Because I realized I had a lot of ideas and I had to be very deliberate in choosing the right ones, because the next thing you know, each idea takes 2 years. Pretty soon you're running out of time. So that's how I got started. And in my journey, the thing that I found, if you look at any list of product success and failure, you'll find dozens of things like teams running out of money, teams not having a good product. But what I found at the heart of all of those things is there's one fundamental thing that goes wrong, and that is that we spend, as entrepreneurs, needless time, money, and effort building something that at the end of the day, nobody really wants. So in other words, we build the wrong product. And so you might ask yourself, why does this happen? And this is the core reason I found, is that it starts with we, the entrepreneurs, we, the innovators. When we look at our idea, the thing we see most clearly is that solution box. So we might think we understand the market, we might think we understand the problem, but we rush up the pyramid to build out the solution and then fail to kind of see what are the more fundamental things, which I will start talking about here today. For me, I come from a technical background, so I knew how to build products. This was a fundamental mind shift, something the sooner you get your head around, the better and more successful you're going to be. And that is realizing that the true product that we build is really a business model and not just the product or the solution. So the business model, not your solution, is the core product. This was the epiphany behind the first book. Maybe we have some readers here in the crowd. The book was kind of organized around these 3 meta principles that I'll quickly outline just to catch everyone up. And I think it's very core to the methodology you are applying in this competition already, but it will just kind of bring that together, and then we'll work from here. So we all start out with an idea. It's kind of fuzzy in our heads. We know that the business plan takes too long to write, so instead we sketch the idea out and ideally sketch multiple variants of those ideas out on a business model. So like Lego blocks, you can put them together, you can make sure that the story works. If it doesn't work on paper, it's probably not going to work outside. And so that's kind of the power of these types of canvases that have become popular. The next thing you need to do is identify not what's easiest to do, but what's riskiest to do. So the world has changed. It used to be that building product was quite hard and expensive, but now that isn't the case. You can, with open source and cloud computing today, build a lot more things than we could in the past. And so we need to prioritize not can we build, not technical feasibility, but rather should we build or will anyone care? So we need to prioritize market risk and customer risk. So prioritize what's riskiest in your business model. And then the lean startup really shines when you take risks, when you take big ideas, and you systematically test them using experiments. So that's the build, measure, learn loop in the lean startup. As you begin to run experiments, you're going to get feedback. That feedback is going to update your understanding of risks, is going to update and change your business model pretty drastically. There's no team that I've worked with that has kept their canvas intact for sometimes even more than a few days. So the first 3 to 6 weeks of an idea's life goes through lots and lots of changes, lots and lots of thrashing, which is great because you'd rather do that earlier when there's lots of uncertainty than just executing and then realizing that you've built something that's now too expensive to change. So this, in many ways, is the one-page slide summary of what I call the business model development process, it's also the 3 meta principles around which that first book, Running Lean, was organized. A lot of you have had exposure with the business model canvas or have used it. I started with this one as well. It was released under the Creative Commons license, and so I began to tweak it. Those of you that may not have seen the Lean canvas, these are some of the changes that I made to them. And my goal when I was making these changes was not really trying to improve the business model canvas to create something better, but it was really coming at it from a different perspective, a different paradigm. So while I look at the business model canvas coming at things, in my opinion, from a strategic viewpoint, which is we have an existing business model, let's reconfigure it to find kind of new business model innovation. I was coming at it from a more fundamental level, which is I was an entrepreneur with no key resources, no key activities, because I was prepared to do anything and everything to make my ideas work. And so to me, the fundamental level is let's start with the customers we want to serve and the problems we need to solve, and then the solutions we need to build. And so that customer problem solution paradigm, in a nutshell, is kind of what's different between the two. Now, those of you that have tried the canvases, I find that one isn't better than the other. Neither of them is going to capture every facet of your business model. The goal here is to take your ideas, distill it down, and then get outside the building, start testing. So whichever canvas you feel gets you out there, that's great. But as I looked at many of my canvases and as I worked with many teams, I found that at the starting gate, there was always a set of universal risks. There was something very fundamental in these canvases that if you get wrong, everything else on the canvas falls apart. And for me, those were these pillars right here, the problem and the customer segment. And the way you think of it is that if you get your customer segments wrong, you're not going to know what their problems are, and so the solution you build is going to be wrong. The channels that you build for those customers are going to be wrong because those were the wrong customers to begin with. Pricing, everything else on that canvas falls apart. So for me, these were the riskiest boxes. So whenever I work with a new team, I dig into these quadrant right here, and I ask these fundamental questions. Who is the customer? Show me the big target addressable customer that you have in mind. Is it big enough? We can start talking about the market and the size to make sure that it's a big enough problem worth solving. Then I want to know who are your early adopters, because if you try to market to everyone, even to a big segment, you end up talking to no one. So you have to really go narrow and figure out who are those right early adopters, what are the distinguishing characteristics, and then what are the top problems that those early adopters have. Not your mainstream customers, but those early adopters. And the logic here is simple. If you hit the easy button and can't even build something or create something for these early adopters, you're not going to have any chance getting to the mainstream market. So we kind of narrow down here and go and focus in on the early adopters. And then finally, and this is a key question, we need to ask ourselves, how are they solving this problem today? And I'll get into a bit more detail about that here in a second. So this is how I get started, and I find that if I can get teams to tell me these 4 answers to these 4 questions, that's a great start. What's even better is if they can show me evidence for these things. So oftentimes we guess in the beginning, and then we get outside the building and try to find evidence for these 4 questions. And if you can get a solid understanding of these 4 things, then you can start moving to the other parts of the canvas and start validating those. Now, there is a problem. So the Lean Canvas, as I said, is very problem-centric. But the problem with problems is that while people get their heads around, I need to start with problems, it's really quite hard for a number of reasons. The first one is that innovator's bias that I showed you kind of creeps its ugly head over and over again throughout the life cycle of building something. So it's hard to shut that off. And what I mean by that is that when I tell people don't think about your solution, they actually think about it even more. So when they start with the customer segment, so they will say, okay, I'm going to build X. They'll say who will probably use X, so they'll start with the customer segment box. And when I say fill out the problem box, they'll turn their solution into a problem statement and then just fill out the problem box. So if I was building a photo sharing app, it's obvious it's because photo sharing is hard, and so that's what they will list as the problem. Photo sharing is very difficult, and they will come up with some reasons. And again, that's not entirely bad. Even getting people to start thinking about problems and not solutions is great, but there is a better way, because this actually gets us to very weak problems, and then you have to get outside and start validating them. The next problem that we run into is that most entrepreneurs run away from problems. So when they encounter the first problem, they'll shift away from it. Can anyone see a common pattern in these discoveries? Just shout out, yes?
Were they accidental discoveries?
That's right, they all were accidents. And it's no accident that a lot of discoveries we find, like these ones, end up being accidents. So in the case of the antibiotic, the first one on there, the scientist had a petri dish that he forgot about. He came back from a summer holiday and found like weird stuff growing in there. And that was the discovery of a life-saving antibiotic. Now, the thing that he did that was fundamentally different is he asked a key question, which is, why did this happen? So for most of us, when we run experiments and we see failure, we tend to run away from it. And so we will go and say, well, this is not what we expected to happen, and we go and try to find other things. So we run away from the core problems. In the lean startup world, we have this magic term called a pivot, which we grossly abuse. A lot of us will call a pivot when we change direction, but if it's not grounded in learning, it's just a disguised see what sticks strategy. So it's a let's throw everything up on the wall and see what works. And that's a brute force technique. Sometimes you get lucky, but more often than not, you just go around spinning in circles. And so again, this fundamentally goes back to the point that when you actually see failure, when you actually see experiments or problems in your business model, it's not a reason to get upset. I actually get a bit happy because that's where you're going to find your key insights. If you think of the word breakthrough requires an unexpected outcome, a different kind of thinking. If every experiment you ran was working and there was no problem in your business model, then you're not on the verge of breakthrough. You're not on the verge of finding anything surprising because everything was already expected. And so I'll chat another scientist here, Buckminster Fuller, to kind of make the point. So a lot of the reasons why we run away from problems is we don't like failure, we don't like public failure. And so if you remove the word failure from your vocabulary entirely and think more like a scientist, you're really making predictions. So your business model is like what a scientist would use to build a model around a problem, in this case, starting a business. We use that model to make predictions. And those are the core assumptions, which is if we do X, customers will do Y. And if those don't hold true, you have an unexpected outcome, not a failure. And so try to find out what's wrong and adjust your model to make that work. That kind of in a nutshell is how you navigate your way. But the key thing, like those inventors did or those discoverers did, is asking that why question. So when you see failure, you have to go back and ask yourself, why did something fundamentally go wrong, and pivot as a result of that, not as a result of you thinking this is not going to work, and let me pick something entirely different. The last reason why this stuff is hard, problems are hard, is that you can't simply ask customers either. First, they don't know themselves. When you ask a customer, what problems do you have, it requires deep introspection. It requires deep, kind of deep 5 whys type of analysis to understand what are root causes of problems. A lot of customers can give you surface reasons why they like something or don't like something, but you have to really extract those root causes, and it's not as simple as just asking customers. That's why things like surveys and focus groups don't really go very far, because we're always just scratching the surface. The second reason why those don't really work is that customers too suffer from this solution bias. They too will fall in love with a solution that they think will solve a problem, but if they don't understand the problem, the solution they give you is just not going to be the right one. Anyone that has a product out there and has dealt with customers probably gets lots of feature requests, and if you study each feature request, it's not typically a problem statement, rather it's a feature request, which is go build a solution for me because I think it is what will solve a problem. From my experience, I've listened to a lot of customers, I've built lots of features they've asked for, and the people who ask them don't even use them. And so it just creates lots and lots of needless waste. And so you have to go behind, again, the solution request, the feature request, and get to the root causes of the problem. Steve Jobs nailed it when he said it's not the customer's job to know what they want, which is why at Apple, they choose the solution box as their box. That's the thing they build. Doesn't mean they don't go and understand customers. They understand customers sometimes better than they understand themselves, which is why they're a very successful company. So you have to get those superpowers. You have to be able to understand the struggle of customers, which is kind of the next section here, is how do we uncover what customers want without asking them and without and avoiding those biases I talked about, the innovator's bias. How does that happen? So there's a new framework. Well, it's an old framework, but there's one that I've been more recently using in my work, and I thought I'd share it with you. And that's the jobs to be done and how it helps in uncovering problems, not by directly attacking the problem and saying, customer, what's the problem? Or innovator, what do you think is the problem? But rather getting around it in a very different manner. Maybe with a show of hands, just to get a sense, how many of you have heard of jobs to be done? So about half of you in the room. So I'll give a little bit of background. So jobs to be done has been around for quite a while. It was popularized by Clayton Christensen, who in his second book, or not second, but in one of his books, The Innovator Solution, I don't know in which order it comes, but in that book, he kind of introduced the concept. And I'll explain what this is here in a second, but there's a famous milkshake study that if you are interested in digging a little bit more, you can go and take a look. He was hired by a major retailer to go and study milkshakes. More importantly, just to crack the problem of them not selling enough milkshakes. And and this retailer had done all kinds of things. They had done surveys and focus groups. And so Clayton Christensen comes with his team, and they uncover things by taking a more jobs approach than kind of a typical focus group type of approach. So it's a worthwhile video to watch. I'm not going to go into this case study, but it's a worthwhile one to get some background. But fundamentally, when you think of jobs, this is the key question you're asking. There's a key insight here that customers don't care about your solution. They really care about progress in their lives. So there's a job that they are trying to get done, and if you can uncover those jobs, things become a lot clearer. So this is kind of the first thing to keep in mind. So when you look at the wide open space and the customer exists in there, they don't just start looking for solutions. There's usually some kind of a triggering event that causes that to happen. So there's a trigger event, and that creates a need. So a trigger event it might be over the holidays, you getting on a scale and realizing you've gained 10 pounds. That becomes a triggering event, and now all of a sudden your world's a bit upside down because you didn't expect that weight gain. And so now you begin searching for solutions. That triggering event is often where you'll find your early adopter criteria. So a lot of people, when they think of early adopters, only think in terms of demographics. So I'm looking for a male in his 60s, and that's my customer. And that is often not enough. You need those things because they help you identify the person. But what's even more powerful are psychographics or behavioral triggers. So what actually causes someone to go in search of a solution? If you can identify that, it gives you a lot of insight on where to find that early adopter and how to market to them, and we'll see examples of all of this. Now, when you have that triggering event, like getting on that scale and realizing you've gained some weight, you begin to look for a better outcome. And so that's the notion of progress. So don't think about problems yet, just think about what are people trying to achieve. So what is the goal or outcome that they are trying to achieve? So in this case, I want to gain 10 pounds, and I want to do it rather quickly, so I might give myself 3 months. So that becomes the goal or the outcome. So that's kind of how you think of customers and their struggle. Now that goal, if it's motivating enough, is going to push me towards it, and that's when I begin searching for solutions. So even getting this far, rather than, again, thinking of problems, try to think of your customer segment and try to think of the outcome they're trying to achieve, and is that outcome something that's motivating them to move towards it or not? Now, the other principle from jobs thinking is this idea of hiring and firing. So before a customer can hire your product, they have to get rid of something else. And this might sound a little bit weird, but it essentially kind of builds on this idea that products don't exist in new markets, that for a product to exist in a new market is often a big red flag, because when a product comes in, you typically have to give up another product to be able to use it. So if someone isn't doing anything about it, then that can be it can be a hard kind of obstacle to climb. So I put this on here. I'm sure this product on here. I'm sure a lot of you know what this is, the Segway scooter. So the inventor of the Segway scooter, by the way, it's a great invention, and the inventor thought this was going to be a mainstream innovation. All of us would have a Segway scooter. So he had a vision like Bill Gates did. So Bill Gates talked about a PC on every desk. He said there would be a Segway scooter with every person. But if we fundamentally go back to that hiring and firing, I'll ask you, if we all had Segway scooters, what would we be giving up? What would we be firing for it to be a mainstream product? Anyone? Walking, that's right. So if you bought a Segway scooter, we wouldn't be walking. And when we make it that simple, it sounds too simple to be true, but that is how you need to think about your kind of idea, is that if people are giving up something that they don't want to give up, walking is very convenient, it's good for us, it's healthy, it's convenient, I can get out of bed and just walk places, I don't have to get on the scooter and drive around. That's one of the reasons why the Segway scooter was not a mainstream product. Again, great invention didn't become a mainstream innovation, and so that's how I distinguish the two. Now, it does have a job, and it's literally hired part-time by the hour when you don't want to walk. So when you're taking a long tourist type of a tour, you would go and you would pay for the Segway scooter literally by the hour. And so it's found its place. The other place where it's commonly deployed are in instances like this. Again, the job that it's trying to do for that context is right on. So these security guards need to be fresh, they need to be able to go fast, they need to be able to chase. The Segway scooter gives them even stature, it makes them taller than they normally would be. So one could say this is almost replacing a horse. So rather than having horses, you can get a Segway scooter, or rather than having a cycle, you can have a Segway scooter. And so those are the alternatives that you're really competing against, not walking in this case. So the way that you kind of look at it on this customer journey is that when people have that triggering event and they've identified their goal, they begin to look for existing alternatives. So on the canvas, you'll find the existing alternative box, and you need to study that. So this is the how do you solve the problem for the customer. Now, the other principle from jobs thinking is that jobs themselves are timeless and transcend categories. So jobs don't actually change. So things that are fundamental, walking, are things we've been doing, but walking is even the action. Getting from point A to point B is actually the thing that's more fundamental. So here's an example of the same job. So all these guys, as you can tell, are maybe on a subway. They are bored. You can see it from their faces. So they're trying to pass time on a boring commute. That's the job. But if you look at all the solutions in this space, they're all different. Someone's using a laptop, someone has an e-book reader, someone has an old traditional book, and then there are two phones in the picture. So if you were going to be competing in this space, you wouldn't be competing against a laptop or a book, you'd be competing against all these products. And so the principle to kind of internalize here is that when we often search for competition, we look for solutions like ours, and then we sometimes convince ourselves that there is no competition because no one is doing what we are doing, when in fact there may be alternatives that are out there that you have to really identify. So that's why on the canvas, on the lean canvas, I didn't use the word competition or competitors because that's where we tend to narrowly think in terms of categories, but I use the word existing alternative. I can't tell you how many shiny startups I've seen killed, not by another shiny startup, but just by Excel and email. So if you look at spreadsheets and email, they're the top killers of many products because that's what people were doing before. Then comes along this startup and says, we can automate all this, we can put all this in this fancy online kind of in the cloud solution. But if people don't shift away from Excel and spreadsheets, they never will ever use your product. So that in many ways is how you need to think of the existing alternatives. Now, the existing alternatives are also where you find opportunities. So if you find existing alternatives that aren't getting the job done, that's where kind of the space for innovation lives. So on this picture, that's the rocks that you see in front of someone. So when they have a goal in mind, they begin to study or begin to consider many alternatives, and you want to find evidence of obstacles. So if somebody is trying to lose weight, they might typically do one of three things, and some of them do all three. They might go on pills, or they might go on diet, or might do exercise. Now, all those three things are possible solutions, but you want to find evidence in your interviews of people still not achieving their goal. And that's where you find problems, and that's where you find space for innovation. So this, in many ways, is a backdoor way to coming to problems, is go and study this customer journey. So visualize your customer, see what triggered a search for a better outcome for themselves. The better you identify those outcomes, the more specific your value proposition will be. And then go and study them. And there are interviewing techniques for doing this. We won't get into that today. But there are interviewing techniques for trying to uncover this type of information. So you ideally want to find a job that's not being done. And in that process, you will find the problems. In that process, you will find the struggle. Now, once you understand that, it's rather downhill from there. Because once you understand the job, the dimensions of your value proposition or unique value proposition become quite obvious. So that's where you can begin to craft an offer. And the offer, if it's a compelling offer, pulls somebody like a magnet. The offer typically is made up of three things. So it's your unique value proposition, which is ideally tied to the specific goal. So if somebody is trying to lose weight in 3 months and have a specific goal of 10 pounds, if your value proposition says exactly that, that gets their attention. So again, the more you can align your unique value proposition with the goal your customer have, the better it's going to be. Next, you want to give them a demo, and the demo is not just any story that you give people. It's not your prettiest screenshot or your best looking kind of visualization that's in your app. Rather, it's a story that you tell your prospect on how they can get from where they are today, which is a world full of problems, to where to where their job is being done. So if you can tell that compelling story, it doesn't require a lot of slides or a lot of even working software or a working product. It just needs to be compelling enough where they can see that you can solve the job for them. And then finally, when you begin to price, which is again another thing a lot of people struggle with, is if you anchor your pricing against these existing alternatives, and instead of pretending they don't exist, actually bring them in the conversation, it's much easier to talk about pricing. So ideally, if someone is spending money and not getting a job done, and you show them a demo where the job can be done and they believe that, and you price either higher or lower depending on the power of your value proposition, it's a much more compelling way to get your prospect to say, yes, I will sign up and I will try your product. And that in many ways is the problem solution fit kind of validation stage. So this in many ways is the information you need to create that compelling offer. Now I'll give you an example. I'll go to a job. I'll go to Steve Jobs, a different type of Jobs. So when he was demoing his iPad, he could have got on stage and said, "We have built the best category device, which is in the tablet category. We have built the most functional, the most usable tablet out there. So all of you pull out your wallets and buy it." And that would have been a pretty weak way for him to pitch his product, and that would be based on the category and because they were first or the only ones there, and that's not a very compelling way for getting a product sold. So what he did instead is when he got on stage, he would tell you not 10 new things you can do with the iPad, because people didn't know what they would do with the iPad, so he had to make that obvious. He would tell you about 10 old things you're already doing with a laptop or a smartphone and how the iPad makes that a lot easier. So he would start with the laptop. So in this code, he talks about how an iPad is more intimate than a laptop. So you wouldn't take your laptop to bed. That's just too nerdy or geeky. But people have no problem taking their iPads to bed. The same thing with the smartphone. A lot of people do work on their smartphones, but you see them struggling with a small screen. And so he would tell you a story of how the iPad has a much bigger screen, a bigger keyboard, and you can actually be productive on it. So it's kind of in between these two devices. But the point here is that he's using the jobs to be done type of thinking. He's talking about 10 old things you were doing that you can now do better with this new innovation, with this new solution. And so fire your laptop when you want to go to bed and work or read or do something. Take the iPad instead. So that's kind of how you think of jobs. Now I'll just talk about two negative forces here because it'll help you just to kind of package this whole customer forces diagram into one. So we talked about the push and the pull. The push comes from the motivation for achieving a goal. The pull is the offer pulling someone. And then there are some negative forces. There is the force of inertia, which is just getting started. So whenever people have to switch from one thing to the other, the initial onboarding, the initial getting them to switch is usually painful. And so when you're designing your product or your minimum viable product, keeping that in mind allows you to design for that first step. If you can reduce friction there, better. There's the other one, which is once people see themselves using the product, there's a different kind of friction, and that's in the usage. That's them realizing, well, what if I try this new thing and then I feel like I am stuck? So in both of these things, oftentimes when you're designing your minimum viable product, you want to address starting anxiety and then switching anxiety once they're going. And the way you do that are typically by risk reversals. So things like money-back guarantees or giving them some time to try a product are all examples of this. So if you don't get value, just ask for your money back and we will make it easy, or cancel any time. So if I use the weight loss example, one of the anxieties is that if I don't have a gym membership and I get a year-long gym membership and this doesn't work, I'm stuck with thousands of dollars in gym membership fees. Well, if a gym membership instead was sold by the month, that would be one way to kind of address that. So again, there are just different ways that you would use to get customers over that hurdle. The thing to point out in this picture, though, is that if you look carefully, the arrows that are motivating the customer up this hill are drawn bigger than the ones down below. And that's because when you're working with early adopters, they typically are visionary. They typically are highly motivated to achieve the outcome. And so they're willing to overcome some friction in your product. So when you're designing your minimum viable product, trying to go overboard and make things too simple or too seamless can be also a form of waste. And so that's just the thing to kind of realize here, is that early adopters will be forgiving because they have above average motivation to get to the goal or to the outcome. Okay, so we'll kind of shift gears and kind of apply this in a case study. So a lot of you know the story of Tesla. So Elon Musk, back in 2005, 2006, when he took over Tesla, had a really hard thing in front of him. He shared his big vision, which is creating an all-affordable electric car for the masses. He wanted to create a mainstream product, and for that to be mainstream, they were targeting a price point of about $35,000. Now, we'll kind of workshop this one together, kind of taking everything I've talked about. If we were applying, if we were Elon Musk and trying to launch this new product, what are some of the riskiest assumptions you think he would have to kind of be wary of, and how would you go about this? So we'll start out by saying throw out some risky assumptions. Try to think of the switching. So when people are switching from whatever they're driving today, it could be a gas-powered vehicle, it could be a hybrid. When they're switching from that to an electric car, what is Elon Musk asking you to do, and where might be some of the problems? What would be some of the things that hold people back? So maybe throw out some things. Limited range. So that's kind of right on. And anyone else want to add anything to it? Yep.
Is there enough infrastructure to charge this where I need to be?
Okay. Infrastructure. Anyone else? Yep.
Another one is there are a lot of patents that go into cars that traditional automakers own, and if you're starting a new automobile company, you don't have access to a lot of things like just suspension. If you want to have a good suspension system, Elon Musk may own lots of other patents, but he doesn't own that. So you have to reinvent the wheel, perhaps literally, to get a car to compete with other cars.
Okay. Sure. Yes.
Like the number of choices, you got one little car to look at versus you got all these makes and models that you can choose from that are made out of those.
All right. Go ahead. The amount of power. Okay. So I think we've got some very interesting kind of risks. And so yeah, the way that I would think through this one is a lot like in that switching. So think of that customer journey. Think of them, let's start with the job. If you look at the fundamental reason people would buy a car, at least a mainstream car, the highest level is getting from point A to point B. So let's ask, how long do people typically drive? And that's why the first one was in some ways right on, because there was a term back then called range anxiety, because people would say, people at that point were buying hybrids, so we knew there was evidence of them wanting to get a greener car or a car that was more fuel efficient. Because gas prices were going up and this was helping the environment and all those reasons. So we knew that was happening. So that was something not as risky to test. But if you went to someone and said, here's an all-electric car, the next question they would probably ask is, how long does it take to charge? Do I have charging infrastructure to do this? But the thing that would even stop the conversation right away is that even if all that existed, the battery technology back then was not enough to get people to go as far as they'd like. So if you now compare apples to apples and say, let's look at a gas-powered vehicle on a full tank, it can typically do 200 to 300 kilometers or miles. But if you look at if you look at the battery technology back then, it was only 50 kilometers or something like 30 miles. And so if you had to only go 30 miles and then have to recharge your car, that was a non-starter for anyone. And so for them, the riskiest assumption became how do we build a better battery? How do we build a better battery that solves the problem of this range anxiety? Because we need to solve the range problem. Otherwise, it doesn't matter if we have charging infrastructure. No one's going to buy it. Enough people are not going to buy it to where we would even have that problem. So that's an example of a scaling risk. It's something that you need when you've got thousands of cars on the road. But if people don't even buy the first car, you don't have that problem. So it's not the riskiest thing. The riskiest thing is how do we get the first customer for the car or the first 10 customers for the car? Even going to early adopters, no early adopter out there would drive a car that would just go 30 miles. And so that's what they started with. And what was interesting is once they came to that realization, they quickly realized that if we are building a battery, we don't even need to build a car, which is why the first car that Tesla put out was this car, which is not a car that they really built at all by themselves. Anyone know what model this is? It's the Lotus, yes. So they went to a car manufacturer, in this case Lotus, and said, we'd like to license your body style because we'd like a sports car, we'd like it to stand out. That was part of their value proposition, because they also realized that electric doesn't have to mean slow. And so if we can put this in a sports car, it would really stand out, because most of the hybrids out there were usually equated with a slow car on the road. But if you put a sports car, everyone will notice it. And if we tell them it can go 200 kilometers or 200 miles, that would get everyone's attention. So they went to Lotus, got their permission to basically take out the combustion engine, put their battery in, slap their logo on it, and they had their minimum viable product. Now, again, a very unconventional way of building a product, but it got them to market faster. It short-circuited a lot of things that a car company would have to do, such as factories, building factories, hiring automotive engineers. They didn't have to do any of that. They instead hired scientists who could work on the battery and focused in on their riskiest assumption. Now, I'll ask you kind of a follow-up question, which is kind of an interesting thing to consider, is that their goal was building an all-affordable electric car, but this is the opposite of that. This is a very expensive sports car. Why start with this one? If they still wanted a sports car, they could have done a Ford Mustang or picked some other sports car that wasn't over $100,000. Why start with such an expensive car? Any ideas? Yes, back.
Yeah, well, if you go above and beyond, then you're able to show people that it's not just going to be a $30,000 car. You can make it so good, and here's a cheaper model of it, so they can understand that it can go further, and there is technology out there.
Sure. Okay.
Going along with that, it raises the expectations people have of the industry of electric cars in general, and changes the industry.
Okay. Yeah.
So maybe similar, but if wealthy would buy it, then certainly when the car comes out to the masses, they would say, oh, I got to buy something that the rich guys get.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
The early adopters would get this, not necessarily a mass car.
And why would they get, what would be, who is the early adopter?
Those are the people that are really into cars, so they want to go fast, they want to go flashy this. Those are the
Okay.
car enthusiasts are your early adopters.
Okay. We'll do one more. I think there was a hand up back there. Already said? Okay. So I think the whole idea of premium first is actually a strategy that many companies use. And one of the advantages of premium, is positioning, is if you put out a really beautiful looking car like this one, and they actually borrowed this beauty from Lotus in this case, it stands out, you start building your brand. There's the premium side to the story, is that when you have a very expensive product, there tends to be more margins, and in their case, they could reinvest all that into their future cars down the road. So those were parts of the strategy. And by the way, Elon Musk had a secret master plan, which he told everyone by blogging about it in 2006, and that was some of what he said. But the other reason that he put in there is something even more fundamental. And the way you come at that one is you ask yourself, what happens to demand when you raise price? If price goes up, demand typically goes down, right? And that was something they were playing with, is that if they had gone and announced a all-affordable electric car back in 2006, they probably would have gotten several thousand, maybe not the 200,000 they got when they announced the Model 3, but they've probably gotten several thousand requests for a car that is $35,000 all electric that could go 200 miles. And then what happens? And that's the oh crap moment. Is we have to deliver all these cars. We have to get enough charging infrastructure. We have to get enough retail outlets to service those cars. The people who buy them, when you buy a $35,000 car, you expect it to work because it's probably your primary vehicle. You expect it to work very well. And they didn't know if any of that was going to happen. They needed time to figure out all of this stuff. And so they decided we would instead go to people who didn't really need a primary vehicle. So let's go to the premium high end. By selling a $100,000 sports car, the people who buy these typically have multiple cars in their garage. They don't rely on this car daily, and they are enthusiasts. A lot of these were probably, the first 10 sales were probably Elon Musk's buddies, him on the phone saying, I have this vision, I'm going to build this car, we don't know when it's going to be built, but I need $100,000 down payment right now, and people would write him checks. I know a handful of people that kind of did exactly that, with no delivery date, and then one day the car shows up 3 years later on your doorstep. But if it had been 5 years, they would have still been okay with it because they didn't miss the money during that time. So that's your classic early adopter. But by going premium high end, they could really limit the production of this vehicle, build hundreds of these cars, which is what they started doing initially, be able to test the riskiest assumption, which is in this case, will the battery actually work, and not worry about all those scaling risks like infrastructure and servicing the car. When the car needed service, people just called Tesla, and Tesla sent what they called a ranger out to your house to service the car because there was nowhere you could take it. You can do that with early adopters when you can count them and know who they are, but when you have thousands of customers and users, you don't often have that luxury because it requires a lot to be able to service them at that point. So this was their strategy, which is let's build a really expensive car, sell it to a few people, but it gives us time to perfect the technology. Then they launched the Model S, which allowed them to then start building cars of their own. They started investing in factories, hired the automotive engineers. They began to invest in infrastructure, so the charging station got built out in that time. They also began to build retail outlets where they could sell these cars, and that was their stage 2. And then finally, once they did all that, they went to stage 3, which was the announcement for the all-affordable electric car, $35,000 starting price, and that's been called one of the biggest product launches of history in terms of the amount of orders they got and the money they raised in that. Something like 200,000 orders in 48 hours, or in a week, I would say, total, was the effect. So again, this is the lesson here is to prioritize your risks not by scaling risks, but rather by the initial starting risks. So don't think about the 1,000th customer or 10,000th customer you want to get. Think of that customer number 1 to customer number 10 and build your scaling infrastructure just for them. If that means going overboard and using what we call in the lean startup world a concierge approach, you can afford to do that because you're going to prioritize learning over scale, which will allow you to get the product right before you actually scale. And so that's a core, sometimes counterintuitive mind shift to internalize, is that you're not trying to get to scale as quickly as possible. You're first trying to get the product right, and then scale comes next. So the final key takeaway, and then if we have time for questions, we can take some questions that I'd like to kind of drive home, is that you can brute force a solution. So a lot of us, when we start out with our ideas, we think we understand the customer and the problem, and as I said, we rush up that pyramid and start falling in love with our solution. But if you think about it this way, if you start with a solution, it's like building a key but not knowing what door it's going to open. So you've got the key now, and then we spend a lot of time trying to find that right door. We try a lot of doors, and sometimes, again, we get lucky, but oftentimes we have to change the key to actually make it work in the doors that we really need to get through. If you simply flip that around and focus on doors or problems worth solving, you have a very different outcome. As entrepreneurs, we are pretty good at key building, and so if you instead fall in love with the problem and not your solution, you can actually open doors to places that you actually want to go to instead of getting stuck and having to go back. So that's all I have. If we have time for questions, happy to take some.
We do have some time for questions, so if you want to raise your hands, I will run mic over to you. There you go.
So a lot of us are students, and we obviously can afford to be like more problem-oriented, but I oftentimes think about startups that spin out of academic research, where you kind of start with this like new groundbreaking technology, and you're like, what do I do with this?
Right.
Like that's a case where I can see you really starting with a solution and like, what can I do with it? What are your thoughts on startups that fall out of those sort of things?
Yeah, so that's great, and I'm not going to say that there isn't a place for invention. So I'll make that distinction a bit clearer that I made earlier, which is invention is finding a new way to do something, and that's where we find research, we find R&D. Even in big companies, they are just playing with technologies to see, can we do something new? Can we find a new method, a new technology? Innovation, though, is taking invention and solving a customer problem. It's turning it into a business model outcome. So when I see startups in the invention space, that's when I'm scared. So a founding startup, you should not be inventing stuff. You should be taking things that have already been invented by other people and seeing if that solution can do the job better. If you look at Apple's history, the times when they had big failures, the Newton 1 and Newton 2, many of you are not kind of even alive probably back then. But that was the time when Steve Jobs exited and the company began building cutting-edge technology. Handwriting recognition on a tablet had never been done before, or on a PDA device had never been done before. And they launched with that and failed miserably 2 times. So when he came back, he got rid of both those products because he always believed in taking technologies that work, that's Apple's tagline, it just works, and then finding interesting places to take them. So when they had the iPhone, they used and half the things that Apple puts out, they don't invent themselves, and that's kind of the thing to internalize. So when the iPhone came out, the multi-touch technology was out there, had been invented by someone else. They pretty much borrowed that and built the iPhone. So they built something amazing, but not by inventing those technologies, but rather by using them to solve a customer problem in a novel way. So the job that we were trying to do with phones, and the job that they were really trying to solve with the iPhone is that we were carrying 3 devices. We had an iPod, or we had a music player, I should say. You had a phone of some sort and a PDA in your pocket, and they merged that into one. And then they brought the multi-touch and all that technology along for the ride. So that's kind of how I look at that.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
All right, there's a microphone coming from over there. If you have a question, if you want to raise your hand, then we can bring you a mic also.
Yeah, I loved your book, Running Lean. It was a textbook for our class. And I've used this lean canvas, and I've seen other canvases like it, and I like the canvas. It looks like a graphical organizer, but the part that's always bothered me is that I don't see a relationship or any meaning behind why the boxes are a certain size or in a certain place. And I wish these graphical organizers had more organization to them that had some purpose or something. But I'm thinking maybe there's an iteration down the road, or there's some more thought behind it I haven't seen.
Well, I'd like to test that. So I'll tell you why it's this way, and that's because I had very little say in it. So that organization was put forth by the Alex Osterwalder team when they came up with the business model canvas. And me kind of riffing on it, wanted to be respectful for the shape and the structure. And so whenever I would take something out, I would put something in. And so I swapped just 4 boxes. And so I kept the shape, but your sentiment is something that I've heard many, many times. And I've actually fought it because I thought if I changed the canvas too drastically, then it wouldn't be recognizable. And sometimes, the best is the perfect of the good. I think Voltaire said that. So if you look at keyboards, the QWERTY keyboard, and it's not a very efficient keyboard. There are better keyboards out there, but we don't switch because the switching cost is too high. So I sometimes worry if that is the case. But like I said, I'm open to testing. If I find enough people interested, we have actually come up with a canvas that reads left to right, that actually I think makes more visual sense. Are you a designer or a right brain thinker by any chance?
I'll claim it, sure, yeah.
Yeah, because I find that they're the ones who really have a problem, and they look at the canvas and they're like, this makes no sense. So I think there's an opportunity to do that. I just sometimes worry if I do that now, it's just going to cause more confusion. But maybe we can cross that.
Got it. Thank you.
Any other questions for Ash? We have a few more minutes. Ian, you have a question? Great.
So I'm interested in like the app and the software space. I write for video games, and I really like the way you approached how like Tesla kind of had the concierge approach, where you approach from the top. Is there examples of people doing that more in kind of that software space? It seems to me that you have to kind of develop to a certain point, and then at some point you just launch to everyone, and then I think you do end up with a lot of problems where you get a lot of feedback really fast and can't change fast enough to really make your game or your app a better product.
Yeah. So there are lots of examples. If you look at Facebook, all the social networks launched to everyone. Facebook just launched on the Harvard campus, and then they went to 3 other schools. And by doing that, it forced them to not worry about technical risk. All the other companies had to raise millions of dollars just to keep the servers up because there were so many users on there. But Facebook built a much better product because they gave themselves time to figure out kind of how this works in a small group. Also, some retrospective insights there is that their big insight that they stumbled into was that they weren't trying to build a brand new social network like all the others. They were trying to take an existing social network that existed in a school in this case and just take that online. And that allowed them to take a very different approach, which Mark Zuckerberg even attributes to their success. But when asked if that was his grand strategy, it wasn't. It was actually something they had to do because they didn't have the money to scale to everyone. So if he had managed to raise millions of dollars, Facebook would have probably gone that different route and maybe they wouldn't be on top today. So that was an example of the constraint of not having money being a gift in their case. So the point of the Tesla story that I particularly like is here's a billionaire, here's a company that could have actually gone the $35,000 route right from the beginning, but they chose a very deliberate, staged, methodical approach. And so I use that case study more with some of the enterprise, the big companies that I work with, because it's the principle of giving yourself permission to scale. I find that startups have no choice. They have to go slow. But even with startups, I would say don't worry about your 10,000 customer, as I said early on, just worry about those first 10. Because if you can't get those, you're not going to get the others. So in your case, you may not have the luxury to get to scale anyways, which is a gift, and don't think of it as a constraint that you have to try to get rid of, as in the case of Facebook.
Sure, thanks.
Sure.
Right behind you.
I have a question regarding market timeliness. How does the BMC or your lean model fit with market timeliness? Specifically, this question is related to one of the Kickstarter projects that I found, Coolest Cooler,
Yep.
which failed 6 months ago to even reach the 60,000 minimum. And 6 months later, they raised 13 million on crowdfunding with the same product. So at what point do you decide what job you're doing and what the job has changed in the 6 months?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's one that you just have to. So I find I'll say it in this way. So I find that startups typically die because they don't have enough customers to talk to. Like they can't find enough customers to talk to because customers hold the answers, not by them telling you, but by you studying them and seeing, again, what job they're trying to accomplish, where the obstacles are. And then, of course, you have to take your solution to them, and that's distribution. So there's kind of a two-part to your question. But if I flip that around, more established companies or more established products die because they stop talking to their own customers. And that's what I find, every business model gets disrupted. All these jobs change over time. There's the initial hire, which is the initial value proposition. And then once you have that, things will change. And if you don't pay attention to that and don't market accordingly, you can get disrupted by someone else. So it is a continual process. So for us, even in our company, when we build products, we build a continuous feedback loop with our customers, and we make it a point to always be hearing from them. We're always trying to understand what jobs are you doing. To give a very simple example, when Lean Canvas initially started out, our audience were tech startups. They were the early adopters. Many of them knew Lean Startup, and so that was the language we were using with them. About 2 years ago, I got a customer support request from someone who struggled with the tool, and when I asked him who he was actually a fisherman in Chile, right? So that's how the customer segment changes, and I was intrigued by that. I asked him, well, how did you find this tool? Because this tool is typically only found in the Lean Startup circles. He said he was at some networking event, basically complaining about having to write a business plan, and someone in the event told him, don't write a business plan, go to leancanvas.com and do a Lean Canvas instead, right? So at that point, his job was, I need to raise financing, and they're asking me for a business plan. I haven't written one in years. Let me see if this Lean Canvas thing helps me instead. And so our insight there is that the job had changed very drastically from our early adopters who knew what this tool was about to now a more mainstream customer who is looking at the alternative not as a tool for Lean Startup, but rather an alternative to the business plan. And so that is what you have to do as an innovator, is that you have to stay on point with your audience as it morphs, because it is going to get bigger and their jobs are going to change with time.
All right. Any other question? Maybe a last question for Ash this evening? All right. Well, join me in thanking Ash Maurya for his
Thank you very much.
wonderful keynote.